Hi panel. I've just completed 2 weeks in hotel quarantine, having spent some time with my mother overseas after she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. My question for you is, with curfews, internal borders and the overseas travel ban, which I might add is the strictest measure of any comparable democracy globally, has the government gone too far, with Australia essentially resembling a North Korean-style dictatorship rather than a modern democracy?
Kim.
So Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights certainly makes clear the right of freedom of movement. But when we bring it back into an Australian context, that doesn't have direct application within Australia. And so the Constitution does become the framework for thinking about this. I mentioned before that there's no reference to citizenship in the Constitution, but there are two key cases that are really important in thinking about whether it is lawful to have these bans as the way they are.
What's your view?
My view is that there is a real question as to their lawfulness because of a right that the High Court identified in an interesting case, Air Caledonia. It was an airline challenging an earlier decision by government to impose what was called a clearance fee for passengers coming through to Australia. And one of the problems with that clearance fee, which Air Caledonia successfully challenged, was that it was actually like a tax. And under the Constitution, you can't have taxing in an act with another piece of legislation. And the key point that the High Court based their decision on, that it was a tax, was that citizens, and they said very clearly, have a common law right of re-entry into Australia. And therefore, that charge couldn't be placed on citizens. That was therefore a tax and had to be separated. So that was one key point that the High Court identified as a right of return. The other is...
What about leaving? Because this is really what the question is about.
It's about the freedom of movement in and out of the country. So in terms of either living here or leaving, they're wrapped up in the one concept. And the more recent case, which many people will be familiar with, is the case that the High Court looked at of Indigenous Australians who are not citizens but who are members of Indigenous families and have lived in Australia. And again, the High Court recognised that there was a clear right for those individuals who are not even citizens but belongers and non-aliens in terms of the constitutional language, of their right of freedom of movement. So there is a peg upon which these individuals could actually challenge the lawfulness of these caps. Now, the government certainly has powers in relation to international trade and commerce, but are there limitations on the extent of that power? And I would argue that there is something in those statements of the High Court to challenge the balancing act that is going on here in terms of these bans in relation to those freedoms.
Krisitina, Keneally, it's a bit unfair, isn't it, to describe Australia as like a North Korean dictatorship?
Look, I can understand, particularly for people who are living in Melbourne right now, who are doing it really tough, that it does feel very oppressive. And you know, I think we've all been saying this, but it needs to be said again, that our hearts go out to them for the situation they're in. I have family I speak to in Melbourne at least once a week, and it's so difficult, especially for the children. But I don't think it's a fair comparison. No, it's not a valid comparison.
Should Australians be allowed to leave more freely if they choose?
Let me say this, Hamish. What I think we should have now, 6 months into this, is a plan. I think we should have a plan, a clearly articulated strategy for what is a COVID normal Australia. What's a COVID normal community? What's a COVID normal economy look like? What we have is a national cabinet, a so-called national cabinet that broke apart. We don't have consensus. We don't even have clear sense of what is the national strategy. Are we going for eradication or suppression? And when it comes to things like, are we allowed to leave the country? You know, as the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, I get a lot of these requests come to my office, and it's wildly varying decisions get made by the Australian Border Force, and I'm not blaming them. They've been foisted this on them with no clear guidelines or rules. They've been asked to invent something overnight. But we're 6 months into this international hard border closure. It's about time we had some clear guidelines. So, for example, you get a situation. I had a man whose wife had miscarried a baby. She was in Lebanon, and he was trying to get over there to be with her, and he wasn't being allowed to leave. Meanwhile, we got a guy here in Sydney that was, because his local member made a representation, got permission to go to Greece and pick up his yacht. I mean, you can't have a different group. You can't have one rule for one group of people and one rule for another. We need some clear guidelines and a plan in place.
Omar, Khorshid's trying to get it.
Yeah, it's pretty clear what the strategy is, even though it hasn't really been communicated well to Australians. But the strategy is suppress and eliminate the virus, get our economy as normal as possible, and hope and pray for a vaccine quickly. And whilst none of our politicians are willing to say it, that's what we've been doing. And these rules, which do seem oppressive at times, if you look at it through that lens, where it's been effective, it actually works, and it's delivered the best health outcomes in the world and the smallest impact on our economy compared with most other countries. So whilst it's tough, it's very difficult, and there's a lot of Australians who've been negatively affected by it. When you look at the alternative, which is Europe-style, tens of thousands of vulnerable people dying and huge economic losses, I think we're doing pretty well here.
Tania de Jong?
I'm going to sing now. We are one, but we are many, and from all the lands on earth we come.
I'm not going to participate in the sing-along.
We share a dream and sing with one voice. I am, you are, we are Australian. Yeah, this song...
You are, I should point out, you are a trained soprano.
I am.
And I'm not.
That's okay, I love doing a duet with you anyway.
But what's the point you want to make?
I just want to say, I mean, this song symbolises a nation whose people, culture, history and landscape are deeply intertwined. Yep. This song celebrates our unity and our diversity, and this crisis has made a mockery of our inclusive spirit. You know, we are supposed to all be Australians, but now we're West Australians, Canberrans, Victorians and so on. Thank you. And thank you for that. And we shut and open our borders on a whim, blocking out the others at the expense of lives, livelihoods, families, our mental and physical health. We're supposed to be one nation, but we've never been more divided, disconnected and depressed. This is not okay. We need a national response, and we need to start including all of the people who are in Australia. And what is the risk of leaving this country? What is the risk to Australia of people being allowed to leave?
I'm just going to draw it back to the original question, which was about leaving the country.
Yeah.
Deputy Prime Minister, the point has been made over and over again. There are so many Australians that have very good, compassionate grounds, it would seem, to leave, to do things like visit a terminally ill mother, that have been, in some cases, not allowed. And yet Tony Abbott is allowed to leave to go and take up a job in Britain. Why?
But to Donald's point about comparing Australia to North Korea, I don't think Kim Jong-un has a job
Yeah, but I'm just asking you why there's one set of rules for many Australians but a different rule for Tony Abbott.
Well, we're also limited by the fact that Qantas and Virgin are not flying internationally. We're limited by the number of airlines flying in and out of Australia. And I appreciate Tony Abbott is but one person.
So why was he allowed out?
Well, he applied for and was granted special exemption. And look, be that as it may...
Isn't Andrew Forrest in Croatia right now?
I have no idea where Andrew Forrest is.
Well, I heard that today. But...
be that as it may, you know, if Australians have the capacity to leave Australia and there is a flight available, then, you know, they should be allowed to do so.
That's just not right. That is just not right. That's not how Border Force are making these decisions. Like, go and have a chat with them. It's got nothing to do with flight capacity. You have to tell them your compelling reason. You have to, if your mother is dying, you have to explain that you are the only person who can go and look after her, that there are no other siblings. Like, they don't ask about flight capacity. They actually ask you to justify your reason for
But there's
leaving
not
the
only
country.
stranded Australians abroad, there's also stranded Australians living on borders. And Krisitina, I have to say, I haven't heard you criticise many of the Labor premiers about the restrictions.
Great. When are you going to pipe up and criticise Peter Gutwein in Tasmania, or Stephen Marshall in South Australia, who has the exact same hard border policies in place as Labor premiers. Quite frankly, this partisanship politicking is not what the country needs right now. What we need right now is a plan. I don't know how the Prime Minister has the time to pick on Labor premiers. He should be focusing on the real enemy, and the real enemy is coronavirus.